Hello there, it's Charlie. This is the podcast To Hell and Back. And this is, you might say, the third step, the third podcast in a row in a journey for me to find the position I want to be taking in relation to the assault on our democratic republic that continues unrelentingly. uh, and which affects so many of us and which has potentially devastating outcomes ahead. Uh, what stance to take? What can I borrow from my experience from being a DBT practitioner for 35 years uh, and from having various smart people that give me input in relation to my first two podcast. So this is going to be the third in the series, and I think I'm getting to where I want to be, and it may or may not be helpful to you, but I hope it's interesting to you, and I would love to hear from you. Any thoughts you have, if you do go to the trouble of listening to this while you walk your dog or drive your car or do your exercise or sit outside in the sun if you're lucky enough, whatever you do to listen to a podcast. So here's where I'm going to start. I once had a patient, I think he was 23, 24 years old, had some antisocial features, and I was in the early stage of doing therapy with him. And one day he came into my office along Main Street in the town where I work, Northampton, Massachusetts. And he said he had his car keys in his hand. And he held the car key up in front of me when he came in while he was still standing. And he said, with an air of kind of satisfaction, wait till those people who own those incredible cars see their cars. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, let's just wait and see how those people who have BMWs and Mercedes and Lexuses and all of those kind of cars, see what they think after they see what's going on with their car. I said, what do you mean what's going on with the car? I said, you did something to their cars. He said, you can do a lot with a key. And so then I knew that he had damaged the car, the surface of the car, by scratching it, keying the car, so to speak, doing real significant surface damage to the cars. So we sat down. I had really strong reaction to that. I was really upset uh, by what he did. It was the very kind of thing that we were going to be trying to work on, but he was going to make it impossible to work on it if he went right back to jail, which is where he had come from. Um, and so when we sat down, I just said, so do you want to be the one to call the police, or do you want me to be the one to call the police? And he said, do we really have to do that? I said, we really have to do that. I said, you can't behave that way. It's not okay. So you want to call or you want me to call? And I was just very firm and stern about it, even though I have to say that um, in the back of my thinking about him, I had compassion for him. I was sad. I was upset that this had happened. This was not the first time this kind of behavior had come up. But I took this extremely strong stance. And then what we worked out within the next few minutes was I called the police station and he got on the phone and he told them what he did. And then they told him to come on in and uh, and then they were going to arrest him. Um, so that's number one. Example number two. I was seeing a family for a little while. It had a family of two teenage kids and a mother and a father. But right at this point in time in the therapy, I was just seeing the mother and the father. And what was noticeable, pretty obvious, and difficult to deal with in a therapy session at first was that the father was very harsh kind of demeaning towards the mother. And as it turns out, as I learned later, he had done a lot of that with his kids too. But when it was just the two of them in the room, and she would say things, and she was quite engaged, interesting, intelligent, making contributions, and he would just dismiss her and say things that were really, I felt wrong. So I was upset by that. I'm not always upset in therapy, but I was upset with that too. And so at a certain point, after giving it a little thought, I said, look, I have to tell you, you're being harsh, dismissive, demeaning, unacceptably so towards your wife. And that has to stop. We have a lot to talk about, and there's a lot we can focus on, but that behavior has to stop because it changes everything. It damages everything. And so I'm sure it's a habit of yours. I'm sure you're conditioned to do this. I'm sure there's a background from which one can understand this, but this has to stop. And and so if you continue to do it in the session with me present, I'm going to stop you every time right there and see if you can proceed uh, without behaving that way, trying to get your point across in a way that isn't harsh, demeaning, or dismissive. Okay. So, and this sort of set a guidepost within our treatment that turned out to be very important to her, and eventually important to him. And I think was looking back was probably the right stance to take. And it, again, like the episode with the 24-year-old man that was keying the car, it required on my part, or at least I decided on my part, to take a hard stand against the behavior, holding the person accountable for the behavior, and at the same time realizing there were backgrounds to these things. There were ways to understand these things. And I had some degree of compassion for the people that I was saying no to. Um, okay, that was number two. So what's dialectical in these examples is from a DBT perspective, Marsha Linehan was coping in case after case when she developed the treatment back in the 1970s with polarization, with rigid black and white thinking, extreme emotions, extreme behaviors, extreme interpersonal positions. And so she kept getting stuck in these things. And she did the best she could to use cognitive behavioral therapy as a basis for problem solving, changing these behaviors, changing these ways of thinking, changing these extreme positions. And then she needed more than just cognitive behavioral therapy. So she added uh, acceptance-oriented approaches that were based in part on mindfulness principles and practice, on Rogerian client-centered therapy, which was a kind of a very acceptance-oriented therapy, and using lots of validation of people in sessions. And so she created a kind of acceptance and change kind of therapy, a change, acceptance, acceptance, change, and would go back and forth between these two. And this worked better. But still, she found that polarization would happen session after session, week after week, crisis after crisis. There would be her on one side of the fence and her client on the other side of the fence. Or there would be other forms in which polarization would move into the treatment, like the client was polarized against themselves, or the therapist was polarized in relation to their DBT team. The whole field could get sort of filled with polarization, which in the psychodynamic world that I had first come from would have been called splitting, and it would have referred to sort of unconscious defense mechanism of splitting, keeping things apart, and creating the conflict. So that isn't how I thought of it within DBT. But Linehan then started using interventions to try to cope with the fact that things remained rigid, and beyond using just problem solving and validation. she started trying other things. She started to use a lot of metaphors. She started using paradoxical interventions where she was actually prescribing the problematic behavior to continue until it could find its way to an end. She had came up with various strategies that she called her dialectical strategies once she landed on the term dialectics. She borrowed most of these interventions from studying family therapies, where the people had to deal with very rigid family systems and came up with sometimes quite irreverent and unusual ways to do that. From martial arts practices such as Aikido, where one had to cope with violence and with aggression and try to do it without being violent and aggressive back, but try to come to a better outcome, to kind of depolarize the situation, you might say, on the mat, and other sorts of things like this. At first, she didn't have a name for this sort of collection of interventions, but in the course of her work, and sort of a strange connection in that it was a secretary of hers that had a husband at University of Washington who was in the philosophy department and was a specialist in dialectical philosophy. And so the secretary suggested that the dialectics seemed to be what Marcia was talking about, being dialectical, thinking dialectically, modeling dialectical behavior. And so Marcia got really interested in that. She had a little sort of seminar about it with her team there and with a dialectical expert. And she started to build in dialectical strategies more into DBT, kind of augmenting the rest of the strategies that are already in place. But then she started to realize that dialectics as a philosophy actually informed the entire treatment. And I don't have time in this podcast to go into all of the ways that happened, but it informed the theory, it informed the assumptions of the treatment, it informed the strategies for getting the client to commit to treatment. It informed the balancing of different types of skills, some that are more acceptance oriented, some more change oriented, and then using them back and forth. So it really started to permeate the entire treatment. So, okay. So that's a little divergence on dialectics that for many of you probably was unnecessary. So I apologize if it just seemed repetitive to you. Um, let's see. What did I want to say to you next about all of this? Okay, I wanted to give now that I've said more formally about dialectics, say that when Linehan brought dialectics into DBT and started to think about it and teach about it and write about it, she would emphasize that really dialectics came with a certain worldview, which was sort of a broad-based perspective about life and especially about how change happens and how truth evolves over time from one moment to another, to one stage to another, etc. So that it's a philosophy, it's a worldview, and in addition to that, and very relevant to what I've just been saying, it can be understood and used as to launch a kind of interventions to persuade people to change behavior. If you understand what's giving rise to behavior in a dialectical way, you might come up with dialectical solutions. So it's a philosophy or a worldview, and it's a method of persuasion. Okay, so um, so now this next example. In my DBT inpatient program, there was a young woman who was while she was with us, she was desperately suicidal. She every day wanted to kill herself. We had to really take protective measures to help her not kill herself and to try to help her find some way to find her life worth living. Um, and one day, her therapist, who was a postdoctoral fellow in the program, so it's not my case and it wasn't my intervention, it was the intervention of her rather young therapist who came up with a brilliant idea. Because this person understood more broadly what was torturing her, not the therapist, but the patient, the client, was that she felt she only had two choices in the world. One choice was to stay alive and suffer, sort of unbearably. And the other was to kill herself and end her suffering. And what things came down, it was sort of as if her life was like a tunnel that got narrower and narrower and narrower until she couldn't go forward any further. She was down to these two choices: kill yourself or suffer, kill yourself or suffer. And she articulated this to her therapist. And her therapist then somehow made this leap, which is an interesting thing about dialectical strategies. Sometimes they require a kind of a leap, a creative leap, like improvisation. So this therapist made this leap by saying, you know what, maybe it's best to think of you as having like an illness that can kill you. And with people, including children, that have illnesses that can kill them, life-threatening conditions, there is this Make-A-Wish Foundation, and it's where you go and you know you're probably going to die. So you try to identify, what do you wish you could have had happen in your life before you died? What's the thing you're going to feel you missed out on the most? And then the foundation tries to help you accomplish that while you're still alive. I said, so the therapist said, so what would be your wish if that was you? And she said, the patient apparently paused, and then she said, I wished I had run in the New York City Marathon. This young woman had grown up in New York City. She had been for many years on the sidelines of the New York City Marathon. She had never been a runner herself. She was most decidedly not a runner herself, but she thought it was great the way this marathon worked in New York. And she just thought it would be great. And she used to think that maybe someday she could do that. But of course, now she was going to probably kill herself. So the therapist's response to that was a dialectical synthesis and trying to help her. It was a dialectical intervention that was an attempt at facilitating some kind of a third option. Because often what you're looking for in a synthesis is a third option. There's option number one, and then there's option number two, and they oppose each other. And both of them have seeds of big trouble in them. And so you look for what's valid in each option and see if you can make a third option and that'll help you move forward. And that helps you get out of that desperate end stage situation. So the therapist's response when she heard this about the New York City Marathon, she said, "Okay, for our next therapy session, bring your tennis shoes." And the patient did, and so did the therapist. And they went outside and they ran together, except the patient could barely run. It was a very short distance. They ran, then they walked a little, then they jogged a little, then they walked a little. And they did that for several therapy sessions. And then she hooked on to a runner's club in the area for beginning runners. They were very supportive of new people. And she started doing that. She eventually left our program, not having killed herself. I eventually ran into her probably 2 years later in New York City by chance. And we talked a little bit. And I said, so, God, when I remember what it was like when you were in the hospital and you wanted to die, and then you decided you wanted to run the New York Marathon. Did you ever run it? She said, I did. A year later, I worked my way up to it. I trained. It's unbelievable because I never thought I could do it. And then I ran it. I said, and you're still alive? She said, yeah, I'm still alive, because all that time went by and I was running. And I got to know a couple other people, and I did other things, and I started to find things that were made my life worth it. And so I'm doing pretty good. So that's an example of a dialectical development, you might say, a step-by-step development from one negative position to an opposing negative position to a synthesis that the therapist helped bring about. And then the patient found her way to a third option, which was, I think she probably said to herself something like, well, I'll continue to live until I've run the New York Marathon, which of course, anyone who's done any running knows that's going to take a long time, not just to run the marathon, but to train to run in the marathon is going to take a long time. So I guess the point up to this point in this podcast is to say that's what dialectics is about. That's where it came from in DBT. It came in first as an augmentation strategy to go along with acceptance and change strategies. And then it became more of a kind of framework for the whole therapy or a philosophy for whole therapy. And it includes philosophy and it includes interventions. A step more about the philosophy so that you understand that part. Some of what comes along with thinking dialectically is this kind of sequence of something emerges, and that gives rise to something that opposes it. And now you've got two things in opposition at the same time and tension between them. And what's dialectical is what happens next. Because if you're being dialectical or if a dialectical process is underway, what happens next is that after a pause where you hold steady while the tension is there, it gives rise to a third option in between. Does not a compromise, but some sort of new construction that allows both sides to continue to, might say both sides have something of a victory. Both sides have some validation from what comes up as your synthesis. So thesis, antithesis, synthesis, this sort of formula, which not all people who develop this philosophy love. They feel it's overly simplistic, and it probably is an overly simplistic superimposition of something on reality, but it's sort of the way a dialectical process works. But there are a couple of basic principles that allow this to happen or promote this happening. One is the principle that everything is moving all the time. Nothing ever is staying the same for even a second. Nothing. You're not the same as you were 5 seconds ago. If you're listening to me, something's different just by listening to me. I'm not the same as I was 5 seconds ago with talking to you. Even if you're just sitting still somewhere, nothing's the same after 5 seconds or after a minute or after a day or after a year. Things are always in motion at every level of reality, down to the smallest subparticles that have been able to be identified by physics, by scientists. So that's one principle, is that change is constant. Change is constant. The world is made up of zillions and zillions of bits, of elements, of energy and matter, and they're always in motion. And the second principle is that things are interdependent, is that nothing stands alone, even if it appears to stand alone. It stands alone in relation to everything else, and especially the things that are most proximal, but everything else, everything is related to everything. So it's systemic thinking. So the systemic philosophy, and there's the constant change philosophy, and then growing out of those rather naturally and setting the stage for dialectical thinking is that things are always, you might say, crashing into each other because it's constant movement and everything's interdependent. So, if you do one thing, it brings about the opposite. It's like principles of physics. Every action has a reaction, an equal and opposite reaction, and that sort of runs through everything. So there's opposition is the nature of reality. It isn't like opposition is an exception, which actually, when I realized, it helped me in doing therapy with people who often are in opposition to what I'm suggesting, to just realize that's just the nature of reality. How could I expect otherwise? I mean, sometimes you don't recognize opposition. Sometimes it's obvious that there's opposition, but there's always opposition. So wanted to just say that about the dialectics and something about the world view about that. So now, what I want to say next, take this. So really, because the whole point of this journey from DBT's version of dialectics to this conversation is because I am driven in a search for how to take a position in my life, in the spaces that I occupy in my life, including this podcast, um, uh, in response to what I experience as an assault on the American way, an assault on the rule of law, all of these things that we hear about in the news every day, an assault on due process, an assault on the Constitution, an assault on compassion towards marginalized people, towards immigrants, towards the poor and the hungry, towards old people, people with disabilities. It's just sort of like there is an unrelenting assault on uh, organizations, institutions, standards of living, thinking, and to me, it's an assault on morality. It's a sanity. It's an assault on the truth, since there's so many lies that come up as part of this. So I experience it when I'm paying attention to it, and it's hard not to, that it's an unrelenting assault. And there's a history to this assault. It goes back decades. I mean, it goes back to the Tea Party movement, back, 2 decades ago. And it goes back even before that, probably beginning with Ronald Reagan and some sort of movement in Republican directions. And then it goes through the course of their becoming sort of in social media and on television, this kind of siloing of points of view. So things are no longer uh, dialogued with opposing positions very much, and people are just reinforcing their own position. So anyway, there's lots of always lots of problems to be solved in our country, in all countries, in life, in reality. There is a problem at the border. Uh, there has been for quite a while. Um, there are problems with fraud and abuse to some degree, and waste within something as large as the government or any other huge organization. All of these things are real problems. Um, so there's validity in the MAGA movement, in the context that gave rise to it, in the history that gave rise to it, in some of the thinking of it. There is some common ground between the MAGA movement and, let's say, Democrats in the current Congress. Um, so you can think from the philosophical point of view that there's dialectic, that there's a dialectical way to understand this. There are things you oppose and there's things you don't oppose. There are things you could agree with. So but my problem has been this. I feel in my gut as it's happening that the appropriate response, and this doesn't mean appropriate by any logical guideline, this is more my own sort of emotion mind, wise mind response to what's going on, is this is terrible. This is going in a terrible direction. And given what I know about history and what lots of people talk about history, this is going right down the playbook of totalitarian leaders in Russia, in China, in Germany of World War II, in Hungary, in Turkey, in North Korea. I mean, all of these totalitarian states had step-by-step pathways through which they went to get to where they are, which are kind of systems that really are different than the United States. So, or what it's been. So, I could be wrong about that. One can't predict the future, but it wouldn't be surprising to me if we keep going down that same road unless something really stops this train. Because this train, this history, this context, this valid set of concerns has found itself manifested in a person, Donald Trump, uh, who has his own uh, vulnerabilities when it comes to feeling that he's been cheated, that he's been mistreated, all his life, and that he has a right to get back at people, and he has a right to dominate, and he has a right to call the shots. And these days, it seems like he has a right to run the world. That he thinks of himself as a genius, that he thinks of himself as better than other people in the government in these things. And he's now surrounded himself with, as I said in two podcasts ago, a several-headed monster, including Elon Musk and other billionaires, Stephen Miller about immigration and other immigration hawks, and people from Project 2025 that are implementing a long thought out recipe for dismantling our government and putting all power in the executive. All of these things are going on. So I feel in my gut, in my soul, that the right response to this is to say no. And that's why I think these podcasts have been about saying no. And I've been thinking a lot about saying no, is really to stop it, to stop this, that this has to be stopped. And the way that I first responded to the guy that keyed those cars, the way I responded to the guy that was just dismissing and demeaning his wife in our sessions, right? That there, at a certain moment in certain situations, the right response isn't to dispassionately, intellectually uh, say, well, what's the dialectic here? If somebody was showing up on your doorstep and you answered the doorbell and they had a gun in their hand and they were going to kill you and your family, it's not the moment to be saying, well, I'm sure that you have valid reasons to want to kill my family and me. That's just not what you do. Your gut just tells you that's not what you do. You try to stop it. You might later investigate, gee, why did this person want to kill me and my family? But at the moment it's happening, you stop it. And I feel like that's what I've been wrestling with because that hasn't felt up to now to me that that's particularly informed by dialectics. Even though dialectics is supposedly in DBT to deal with polarization. I hope this conflict is a little clearer now at this point that you can understand it, and maybe some of you can partly identify with it, because and also, by the way, those of us who've trained for years and years and years as therapists, it's not the usual intervention in our lives. It kind of goes a little bit against the way therapists are taught to intervene often, to say, stop it. I mean, there's one joke skit by Bob Newhart from many years ago where he's being a therapist and he actually says stop it to his patient as a form of treatment. Um, but so stopping it is what I think is the right thing to do. I don't think I've been trained to do that particularly. I'm trying to learn how to take these positions to say no, even though I have had mentors that are capable of acting this way. One was Otto Kernberg, who was my first mentor, and then Marsha Linehan. Both of them are capable of really holding people accountable. And that influenced me. So that actually helped me take those positions and realize that can be part of psychotherapy as well. When you see things going on that need to be stopped. So, but then what does that have to do with dialectics then? Because what do you do when you say stop it? When somebody is ruining the American way of life, there's an impulse, there's a violent impulse, counter violence if you feel that you're being violated, and that's a natural response. But if you engage in that, as one person responded in an email in response to one of my other podcasts, if you engage in that as your response, you wouldn't call that a dialectical response. You would call that violence begets violence, and which then perpetuates more violence. So it really doesn't get out of the violence problem. You just become a perpetrator of violence as well, even though it was in self-defense. And now the next moment is probably going to give rise to more violence. So there is polarization, yes. There's violence against violence. That's a form of polarization, yes. But does dialectics have something to offer here? And in thinking about that, here's what I want to now say, because I think I've sort of found another step forward about this. I found myself in the last few days thinking about, and this also was triggered by one comment by one email in response to my podcast, um, someone who mentioned nonviolent civil disobedience as a different stance in response to these kinds of things that are going on. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, there was a fair amount of study that I did way back in college, maybe even high school, of Mahatma Gandhi, and then Martin and his influence on Martin Luther King. And Mahatma Gandhi as kind of like you might say the father of nonviolent civil disobedience. So I've been thinking about that and thinking, well, where does that fit into here? Because actually, Gandhi, when he was about 24 years old, and he had just finished being trained as a lawyer, I think in England, and he went to South Africa to do work there, and immediately found that by virtue of the color of his skin, he was discriminated against. He was treated demeaningly, humiliated. He was restricted, and it was just incredibly difficult. And he had a couple of incidents happen during which he kind of came upon naturally, out of his wise mind, I guess, using DBT terminology, the truth for him. And the truth for him was that he would not allow himself to participate in a humiliating manner. If he was being humiliated by others, he would not participate in that. He would block it. I don't have right now in my head the details of that, but it was sort of what he came to was the idea that he may not, if somebody was going to spit on him, it isn't that he's going to spit back on them, but he's going to either remove himself from that situation or he's going to respond in a way that does not satisfy the spitter, that doesn't give the spitter the feeling that he has accepted a demeaned position. So he would fight against allowing himself to feel demeaned and continue to participate in that way. And that was his way of saying no. And he could do it very firmly. And he took various positions. And it became something he did for decades there and then up in India against oppression. And so it became a sort of a way to say no and to act with dignity, to say no and to act in such a manner that opened the possibility that dialogue could happen, genuine dialogue, opened the possibility that compassion could happen, even though it wasn't being exercised at that moment. Treated the other person as if maybe there was some hope, and at the same time shut down a humiliating stances by other people as much as he could. So that was sort of the birth of nonviolent civil disobedience. There was a psychologist that many of you probably know of, but it's been a lot of years now, so I don't know if anyone's still reading him, Erik Erikson, who wrote a book at one point about Gandhi and ideas associated with Gandhi called Gandhi's Truth. And what I'm describing right now is essentially, from what I remember of reading that book 50 years ago, that was Gandhi's truth that Erik Erikson was writing about. Was the truth was that you would say no, you would oppose something, but that at the same time you could consider the possibility of being open to that other side or even loving that other side. And then Martin Luther King picked up on this and really the idea that you could even still have understanding of your enemy, compassion for your enemy, and even love for your enemy. And that might even make you a more effective fighter for change. You could go all out because you also restrained yourself from hitting back, but you treated yourself and the other person more with dignity, and then accepted the consequences of the situation, which could be very painful, as many people in the civil rights movement found. So I think that the civil rights movement and Gandhi and Martin Luther King and nonviolent civil disobedience offers, I think, a sort of synthesis um, that allows you or even instructs you to take a hard line position about stopping the abuse, stopping the bad treatment, stopping things that are going on that hurt people in the process without stopping and analyzing or using dialectical strategies per se, but it's done at the same time in such a way and with a certain demeanor and a certain attitude that says, okay, okay, this is what I'm doing now. I'm stopping this, I'm stopping this, I'm stopping this, and I won't be surprised if somebody keeps hitting back at me and trying to demean me and put me down. But I'm not going to stoop to that. I'm not going to fight back like that. I'm going to hold myself with dignity and I'm going to resist, 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 articulate that, take those stances and do it in a way that conveys the way you want relationships to go, the way you want people to behave, the modeling that you want to do. So to me, there's a kind of for further thought for me, but that's a dialectical position that I think will help me, already does help me in responding to pieces of news that I hear, in planning to go out to another protest, in deciding whether I want to take any other actions. One action I decided to take beginning many weeks ago was to begin to use this space, this podcast, at least some of the time, though not all the time, um, to address these things and know that at least somebody else is going to be listening. And so that's a contribution. Like in the past, in the last podcast I did about the skill of saying no, I've heard back from several people they found it useful to have something that helps frame it that way, that it's actually a skill to be able to say no. And even going to a protest out on the street, even if you don't think that it's going to be helpful in some ways, in a way, it's a training ground for saying no. It's where people reinforce each other for saying no. People get ways of saying no, words with which to say no, uh, signs with which to say no, um, and to be in solidarity with each other. So it's by no means trivial. And my current thinking about the spaces that all of us have, all of us who believe in resisting and opposing the current direction that I'm talking about, um, is that everybody has a different space. For some people, a space is a podcast. For some people, a space is just conversations with other people. For some people, a space is going out to a demonstration or writing letters or calling Congress people or writing an article for a newspaper, or writing a letter to the editor, or whatever it is, going to a school committee meeting and speaking up and stopping certain ways of like talking about getting rid of books or things. It's so there's everybody has a space, even if it's a small space. And I think the idea is that if only everybody who feels like saying no can find where and how and muster up the courage to say no repeatedly and meaningfully, and with a sense of dignity at the same time, so as not to stoop down and fight back in a mudslinging fight or a violence fight. I think that that's a good way to go, and it may be one of the last things, if enough people did it, meaning in the tens of millions, that offers the possibility of stopping this slide, this relentless attack toward what looks like fascism. Um, and one can go back and study what happened in Italy with Mussolini in the 1930s in order to see a kind of like an unbelievable example of how that can happen and how many steps that Trump is taking and his people that are similar to that. So and I'm just, I guess this is a political statement as well as a podcast that grows out of DBT and dialectics and therapy. So I hope that that's okay with you. I hope it's useful for you. And I hope you'll give me feedback, including even if you hate this. Write me an email at c.robert.swenson@gmail.com, or you can write me an email through my website, charlieswenson.com, where my podcasts are archived as well. Or you can leave a comment wherever you get this podcast. So, all right. All right. I'm not sure I'm going to continue on this topic next time. I have some other ideas in mind about what I'm going to be doing, but thank you for listening if you are still hanging in there. And and if you're of a similar persuasion as I am, if you recognize the same dangers I recognize, I hope you're finding your own way uh, to uh, to do what you feel is the right thing to do. Okay, very good. We're going to stop right there. Adios.